Hello, my name is Richard Parry. I'm the director of Glasgow International, and I'm delighted to be here with the writer Moira Jeffrey, the curator of the Carol Rhodes Estate, Andrew Mummery, and with the artist Merlin James, who, together with Carol Rhodes, set up the gallery 42 Carlton Place in their home. So this is a talk that runs in parallel with the exhibition at Kelvingrove Art Gallery Museum, which runs as part of Glasgow International Festival 2021, 11th of June to the 27th of June. This exhibition actually runs a little bit longer until the 4th of July. We're pre-recording this talk so that you can enjoy it throughout the festival, but we will be organising a live Q&A at a certain point, so do look out on our social media and other channels to learn more information about that. And I would also invite people to explore the rest of the online program, which includes videos, sound works, other works by artists, podcasts, and a whole lot more. So please do check that out. And now over to the panel. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Moira Jeffrey, and I'm a writer based here in Glasgow. And I'm here today with Andrew Mummery, who's the curator of Carol Rhodes Estate, and with the artist Merlin James. And we're here to talk about See the World, the major survey of Carol Rhodes paintings, which is at Kelvingrove Museum for Glasgow International. Carol Rhodes was born in Edinburgh in 1959, and she passed away in Glasgow in 2018. She was brought up in Bengal, India, and returned to the UK as a teenager, and she studied at Glasgow School of Art between 1977 and 1982. During the 1980s, Rhodes was actively involved in the women's movement and in the protests at places like Greenham Common and Faslane, as well as political and cultural activism in Glasgow. For example, she was on one of the early committees at the Transmission Gallery, and she was a founder member of the Glasgow Free University, which was a kind of radical programme of public education. In the mid-90s, Carol Rhodes returned to painting, and from 1998, she exhibited regularly at the Andrew Mummery and Mummery and Schnell galleries in London. In 2012, with her partner Merlin James, she set up an exhibition space in their home studio at 42 Carlton Place in Glasgow. And there they co-curated exhibitions of work by, among others, the artists Christina Ramberg, Adrian Morris, and Louis-Michel Alchemius. Rhodes was diagnosed with motor neuron disease in 2013. Carol Rhodes was known for her paintings of partly fictional, partly human-made landscapes, combinations of the natural and the artificial, and they're suspended between intimacy and a kind of estrangement. And this first posthumous solo exhibition in Scotland focused closely on Rhodes's rarely exhibited drawings alongside some key paintings, and it invites a close examination of her artistic processes and her preoccupations. These works focus on very particular kinds of spaces, topographic blind spots, edgelands, peripheries, what you might call non-places, such as service stations, airports, railway depots, development and distribution centres, trade parks, brownfields, the industrial belt. And these are environments that are often associated with the flow, I think, of material and of labour, of storage and distribution, but also the kind of mining of natural resources, the deposit of industrial waste and byproducts. In Carol Rhodes' paintings, human activity is everywhere, yet human beings themselves don't feature. And the place and state of the human body and of the psyche is highly ambiguous. She drew upon various sources, from geography textbooks, environmental surveys, urban planning manuals, and her own photographs, sometimes even taken from helicopters and planes. The distance and the detachment of that aerial viewpoint is critical, and absence and displacement are themes throughout her art. I'm very pleased to be here today with Andrew and with Merlin. And I wanted to begin with Andrew. I wanted to ask Andrew, if you could talk us through the ideas behind this exhibition. So in 2017, you curated a major exhibition of Carol's work at the MAC in Belfast. That show was called Survey, which was a kind of canny pun, I think, around the idea of the artistic survey, but also the sense of survey as in land and planning, and a kind of dystopian undertow, I think, possibly of surveillance. This particular exhibition brings together 40 works. I think I initially said paintings, but I did mean paintings and drawings, so forgive me. 11 paintings, 29 drawings, and the drawings weren't often exhibited. For a long time, the artists considered them to be preparatory works, you know, what you would know as cartoons, rather than artworks in their own right. What did you want to undertake with this project here in Carol's home city?
Well, I thought it was first of all, thank you for that kind introduction. I think that it was a really quite exciting opportunity to show the drawings for the first time as a large group. Previous exhibitions that I did either in my gallery in London or at the survey show MAC in Belfast, the drawings were shown alongside paintings, but here the drawings really are the centre piece of the show. And it was quite fortuitous timing in the sense that Merlin and I had been doing quite a lot of research in Carol's studio, and there's a splendid old plans chest in there which contained a lot of drawings, because she just kept them in drawers, just in piles, basically. Once she'd finished, they had their use, they were put away. And we found that there was a far greater range than we'd actually anticipated that there would be. And it was an opportunity really to sort of say, well, let's have a look at where these paintings came from in some ways, and to perhaps shed some light on the thought processes behind them. And what has been revealed, actually, I think it comes across in the show, I hope it comes across in the show, is the quite methodical nature of her drawing practice. Her painting practice was extremely methodical, but it's the two have a very interesting parallel. And then when we thought about, well, it would be nice to show paintings as well as drawings. It doesn't really make complete sense to just have a drawing show, because painting was really crucial. It was the key thing to Carol's work. And the nice thing was it gave the advantage of actually borrowing paintings from some collections which haven't been seen in public for a very long time. I mean, some of the early paintings, which we'll come to talk about a bit later, one or two of those haven't been seen for almost 30 years. And they won't be familiar to audiences, even those who know some of Carol's work already. So the two things that really I had in mind was to show the depth of the drawings and the way that her thought process are illustrated through those drawings. And we also we thought it would be nice to do is to show some of the other material that was in the studio that was around on tabletops, on shelves. So the exhibition contains a vitrine which contains all sorts of different material, things we found in drawers, sketchbooks, studies, piles of photographs, books, coloured crayons. So there's a really a little insight, if you like, into Carol's working environment as well as the work itself.
I'm recalling kind of stepping into that space at Kelvingrove, and the exhibition begins with an early mature work, if that makes sense, a work that reflects Carol's mature painting, entitled Aeroplane. And I kind of wanted to begin there, literally at the beginning, but also because it seems to tell me something that is quite hard but important to articulate about the work. There's an ambiguity in this painting. It's a aeroplane apparently in flight, but you can't quite tell what's airspace, what's land, what might potentially be sea. There's a sense of sort of stilled motion in the image and a kind of painterly heaviness. But there's also something kind of incredibly natural, I think, about this plane. When I first looked at it, it felt to me almost like it was a kind of whale or a sea mammal kind of moving, according to its own agenda, somehow moving unobserved, perhaps in deep water, that seemed to kind of sum up a whole complex relationship between the man-made, the natural world, pictorial space. I wonder, Andrew, if I could ask you just to say something about those earlier or little-known works included in the exhibition where we do see the artist really developing a very distinctive voice and pictorial sense of self.
Well, this was one of the, for me, one of the joys of actually putting this exhibition together was to be able to get that painting and the painting of the caravan and a painting of a tent. And I'm not sure that those have ever been seen in the same exhibition before. And if not, they haven't, certainly not for 30-odd years. And what is also very interesting, there's a lot more work to be done, I think, on the very early period when Carol started painting again, and we're finding more clues to this within the sketchbooks, that developing ideas of what a painting can be and how that can reflect her relationship to where she is and her relationship to the world around her. And these early ones, I think there is this idea of being above something, but not quite fixed to the ground. So a caravan is something that moves around. It's not a permanent home. A tent, similarly. There's also her relation to the landscape, and I think we could talk a bit more about it. She certainly would go out, walking, and there was a direct relationship that she had with the world around her. And I think what's fascinating about these very early works is that she's finding a subject matter and a reason for painting. Because it was 10 years or so, I think, between the time when she finished at art school and actually really started painting again. And it's somebody trying to discover a language, I think. And I think that's what's so interesting about these early paintings. And also stylistically, you will see how quickly the style develops, that becomes much more almost like finessed, if you like. But there's something, I think, really quite fascinating. But this kind, yes, is this with a slight elevator. It's this not quite being fixed. Perhaps looking for some way of being grounded in some way. I mean, perhaps Merlin will probably have something more to say about that side of seeing the world. This is your title, wasn't it, Merlin?
Seeing the world was a title I suggested because I'm trying to write something again on Carol. I've written on her work in the past, and I'm trying to write on it again now. And I'd see the world, or seeing the world, is my kind of working title. Yes. I
wanted to really quickly get on to painterliness, the utter magic and distinctiveness of Carol's painting. So small in scale, modest might be a word that people use, hard of surface, not expressive surface, and yet somehow utterly animated and sometimes kind of shockingly alive. As a painter, I wonder if you could tell us about how you see and understand those qualities.
Very different painter to myself, of course, and huge intensity in the work and huge discipline and rigor in the work, and, as you say, a hardness in a way, and an unsentimentality. And then this affection, or as you say, the aeroplane. It's this object, I think, for which she has immense affection, as well. And here, this is one of the Tate paintings with the aeroplanes around the hubs. There's a great affection for things, I think, and for things that you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be affection, or ambivalence, for things that we have every reason to not love in some ways, like the polluting aeroplane, which we have so much fewer of at the moment, one of the good, and the whole infrastructure of the human-made the industrial and the post-industrial, which I think all the negative connotations of all that is in the work as well, and yet it's so far from being didactically a comment on ecology or a comment on the human.
There's a real kind of lavishing of painterly attention, isn't there? And there's something extraordinary about the finesse, which is never too much, just enough, a sense of recognition about a kind of minimum level of information.
She was
but a kind of nuance of the hand.
She was always, the process was one, once she got onto the board, when she was painting on the board, as after the prehistory of the drawing and so on, the process was always one of wiping off, painting, dissatisfaction, wiping it off again, paint it again, wipe it off again. So she, at the end, she wanted a single layer of paint on the surface, mostly. Sometimes it's layered, or later in the work, she gets more interested in layers, but yes, it has to be alla prima in a way, but it's the opposite of alla prima. It's the nth degree of dissatisfaction and reiterate, trying again. And it's to capture something. It's to capture the reality of of what she's describing, it's the rightness of the truth to the subject as well as the truth to the construct that is the work of art,
And there's a kind of analogy there. Somehow there's a kind of restlessness in the image, and at
Very
the same
much.
time, there's a sense of holding, stillness, composition, and that is right through from what might be happening inside the artist's head to the painterly expression in the hand.
Yeah, the psychology, as it were, in the paintings is more and more evident, I think, and more and more, and emerges as more and more subtle and complicated than. And it relates to her own. Obviously, it relates probably on a biographical level to her own difficulties and ambiguities and ambivalences about, belonging and settledness. And these early paintings where everything is slightly off the ground, even buildings feel unrooted and unfoundationed. And then she would go on to make these buildings to depict these buildings that do sit on the surface more than they don't really have footings in the earth in the way that
it's interesting, isn't it? The sense of where foundations may or may not lie, a kind of sense of being untethered seems to be really important. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the way that Carol worked and the way that she used materials. So Andrew's already mentioned that we have a lovely vitrine that shows us some of the kind of source material, photographs, source books, drawings. These touch on all kinds of areas, geological and geographical phenomena, industrial landscapes, but also Renaissance painting. Amongst the materials that there, I'm particularly fond, I think, of the Guide to British Shopping Centres. There's this love of the kind of prosaic landscape, of the lived world. It seems really important when I think about that book about the shopping centres. I always think about the era that Carol made many of these early works in, and it's not quite pre-internet, but it's before the easy flow of images, which is, the flow of images is such a huge subject for painting these days. But at the time, she had to really actively seek out the source material that she wanted. Can you tell us a little bit about how she worked with sources?
Yes, I mean, of course, that was before I knew her, when she evolved all these foundations for the work. But she would, she would order photographs from a photo agency. In the vitrine, there's a photograph that she's ordered from an agency in the 90s sometime for, I think not this airport, but I think Gatwick Airport, an aerial view of Gatwick Airport. That's a basis of drawing that's in the exhibition, and a painting. I think we've got both the painting and the drawing in the exhibition, and then this source photo that's an 8x12, and on the back it's got a stamp from a photo agency. So yes, I mean, she was very interested ultimately in Google Earth and so on, although she didn't really work from Google Earth ever, but yes, it wasn't many years before that she would take photos from planes when she was flying. She went up in a helicopter at least once, and in light aircraft and old World War II aircraft circling around Glasgow and things, quite slightly unofficial.
And she's using these sources to create what's not an entirely invented landscape. It's this unusual combination of real visual source material, but recast to her own purposes.
Yeah, it's marrying together these separate, and this feeling that she had access to the whole globe in her studio. And there were ranks and ranks and ranks of books, geographical textbooks and survey books from Canada and South America, I mean, right across the globe. And she would have a real strong sense of, you know, the Galapagos Islands or the you know, places that she was never going to go to and never had been to. But I think when, you know, from early on, she was as a child, as a baby, living in India, growing up, and then the family would come back on leave, and usually by ship, and the ship, you know, so you have this long journey. It would stop in South Africa, and it would stop in, you know, on the edge of Spain somewhere. And they'd have shore leave, you know, over a 6-day journey or something. You'd have 6 stops, and then I think all that fed in, you know, very much. And this person not knowing whether, well, feeling India was home. Yeah. But this being told that the UK was somehow home.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about this idea of kind of place and subject matter. So, you know, I can think of artists who might be similar in the sense that they have that absolute consistency of kind of visual or emotional tone that we see in Carol's work. But it's really hard to think about somebody who's commanded such a distinctive, consistent and kind of specific interest in a particular kind of place, these sort of edgelands, peripheries, this urban fringe. Despite the use of the sources and that kind of specificity, I think there's also a kind of mischief in the paintings. You know, there's a sense that when you first look at them, there's a kind of coherence, and maybe the drawings, we can come back to this, might tell us something about that. But there's also a kind of visual puzzle within them, the roads that go nowhere, kind of ambiguous territories. Sometimes you look at the topographical features and you think, oh, you know, that's a mound. And then you look again and you realize, you know, it's not convex, it's concave, it's a basin. You know, she once said that I love my subject matter both for itself and for what it lets me do in the paintings. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that imaginative aspect of the work and how that is made by the painterly.
Yeah, I don't know how, as Andrew said, it happened very quickly, I think, around 1994. I mean, there's 2 or 3 years of very interesting exploratory painting up till that. Tents and the strange sort of Scottish, things also about Scottish identity, and peat bogs with a flying grouse and things that look quite like sort of Edwardian Scottish painting of, you know, Scotland as a landscape. And then really all in 1994, she goes from those paintings, which, as you say, Andrew, there's a feeling that she had to unlearn quite a lot of skill and almost go back to a naive or a fairly primitive kind of descriptive method in some of those paintings. Because at art school, there's existing things from art school that are very proficient: figurative drawing, self-portraits, life drawings, very proficient abstract paintings, big, colourful abstract expressionist exercises, you know, other things that are quite close to 80s Glasgow, new image painting, you know, Stephen Campbell and people that were her contemporaries. It's as if she had tried a lot of things and been proficient in them, and then had to start again. There's a real feeling of starting again in 1992-3 with the basics of painting, and then quickly coming up to, you know, doing the aeroplane painting, and then quickly coming up to a painting called Bay, which was the opening painting at the Mac show, I think, which is 1994, which is already sort of the Carol Rhodes formula, the particular height from the ground and the particular perspective. And I think there is still a horizon line in Bay, but the horizon line quickly rises up out of the painting, as here. And
Bay's a good place, I think, to be thinking, because I'm really interested about this kind of coastal riverside aspect of Carol's work. She grew up in India. She grew up beside a great river, the Ganges, and ended up living and working by another great industrial river, the Clyde. And there's a kind of, I think, a kind of estuary, or estuarine, is that right?
Estuarial. Where do you put the stress?
We'll settle this one later, but a certain kind of pool, interestingly, a kind of tidal pool on the work, and a really interesting language around stillness and flow. We'll look at some of the works, I think, that talk about kind of barriers and fortifications at the edge of water.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could kind of understand that some of that might come from childhood background in India. I think it would be interesting to kind of tease out what India might mean. Some of that might be the water, a very distinctive colour palette, perhaps.
Yeah.
But also maybe this psychological framework that I think you alluded to of being an outsider. And that wasn't necessarily always a kind of tragic position. In a way, it really fed into Carol's politics. I mean, I was interested, she once said that the way that she looked at things from above was a kind of detachment. And she said that to have an opinion or a view, you have to sometimes be outside of society or your peer group to observe, even if only for a few minutes. I wonder if we could talk about that edge perspective and that detachment.
Yeah. Yes, at the biographical level, it's huge. Yes, living in a kind of university compound on the very edge of the Hooghly, really, which is a tributary of the. I mean, the Ganges tends to be used as the name for all of the. It's
the network,
the waters of India, but the Hooghly, the Ganges, right there across the street. I mean, actually, very different, but. One of the things about where we moved to then, 42 Carlton Place here, was this, that she liked, was it was this same thing of the sort of house, and then a road, and then a railing, and then the river bank and the river, and it was the same, and then our studios are at the back, and it was like a little mini compound of the sort she remembered from. And she was also in Serampore there. It was right next door to a jute mill that was a very industrialized and politicized zone of people, very exploited workers living in hovels really around the jute mill, and a waterworks, a kind of water purification plant. All this was, so all of that was, it was there very, very, from the beginning, all these, and she went back at, what turned out to be nearly the end of her life. In 2013, 14, she made 2 more trips back to Serampore, to that, and Calcutta, having not been there for 25 years or something. There came a point where she said she had to stop going back to India, really after she'd graduated college. Right through college, she kept going back for spells. But there came a point where she said, I have to commit to where I am, Scotland really, or where Europe, the UK. And prior to that, she had always felt unrooted, I think, and people talk about her, the way she floated and physically, which is, it was true when I knew her too, but particularly when young, she had this hovercraft sort of way of proceeding through the world, which, I mean, she never lost that either, but that floating thing of are you, whether you're quite, where your footprint is, but she did make a conscious effort to root in Scotland.
And really actively as part of a kind of political community.
Yes, and as Andrew was alluding, hill walking, camping, these were just social, recreational things, but there was a sort of political dimension to them, and it would also be to do with camping at Green. I mean, it was the Greenham was a camp, and full of tents, like the ones she depicted and so on. Yeah.
Andrew, I want to talk now a little bit about the drawings,
Yeah.
because that's such a significant part of this exhibition. And it's fascinating to see them, to see them as a group. And in them, we see this kind of ordering intelligence, I think, a discipline and very careful composition. What do you know about how the drawings are made?
Well, this is what's been interesting, is actually learning more and more about this. I mean, my first experience of the drawings was seeing what we might say the finished cartoons, the drawings which she used to actually trace the composition onto the ground, the support, the hard gessoed support that she used. But there was an awful lot of stages between that. I was sort of assumed that she largely worked out the whole thing on one sheet of paper. Occasionally you get things added, you can see bits added, but it seems that actually we found things recently which suggest that actually there's several stages before you even get to that. And it's interesting that, you know, she talked a lot, and we mentioned this, about how important the physical nature of the paint was, and the making of the paintings, and how everything would change when the painting is made. But something clearly is the same thing is happening with the drawings.
Yes.
And, you know, it's interesting, in a way you see the paint is a medium, really, in which anything can turn into anything else. And I think she felt that was very important. But, you know, with the pencil as well, they're pencil and an eraser. That's what she found very exciting about that. And you can see there's an awful lot of erasing in those drawings.
Yeah, huge changes.
And then there's different colours added as she would then retrace elements back onto the support. So they become an extended compositional method, I suppose.
Yeah.
Starting from, I mean, quite instinctively, I just think there's this collective memory somehow of all these images that she's been from photographs, from books, from walking, from being on a bus, and it's this, somehow they come together, and when she starts working them out, she develops these compositions. The compositions stay the same, they don't change. The actual outline is the painting is one thing, the drawings, I think, increasingly be seen as something else. But
Yeah.
that very particular touch, the weight, even the material of the paper.
Yeah,
There's lots and lots
really
of
important.
different sorts of paper we found, just blank sheets or with scribbles on them, or just testing things out. It's been really fascinating, that side of it. It's clear in the paintings, I think. You can see that very much in the paintings. It's been evidenced for some time. Lots of people have written about that. But what hasn't really been seen, I think, is a range of drawings from the early ideas, also what the function would be, or how the function would take place. There's a very early, the drawing for that painting, in fact, is one of the first things you see in the show.
Yes,
and it's
this size,
small, and it's squared up in the traditional way of enlarging. She didn't do that very much longer. They actually, most of the drawings you'll see in the show are the same size exactly the same size as the support, because they, as I said, they were used to trace the composition. So that's something that I found very interesting looking at this, and I think that's why it's nice to see them, even with a few paintings that there are in the show. And a couple of times we've juxtaposed a painting and the drawing that it's for, which was always whether Carol was always sort of slightly ambivalent about whether that was really what she wanted. But then I remember that the first time I ever showed a drawing in 2006 was shown next to the painting that it was the cartoon for. So the first time so Carol must have agreed.
She conceded to it. She was hesitant about showing them for a long time.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, as you say, the materials, she was fetishistic about the materials. We'd go to London and go to Faulkner Fine Papers, which is no longer there, and that would get a lot of paper from, or John Purcell, paper dealers who, and she would buy these papers. They're very thin, very hard. She didn't want, it's very rare that she uses anything like a watercolor paper or a paper with tooth or, with noticeable sort of character to it. She'd buy all these, she loved these kind of calendared, hard book papers that are really for printing, and particularly, Bible paper, India Bible paper, which is this very, very thin, hard stuff. And yeah, she'd buy 1 or 2 sheets across a vast range of this, and they're all in the plans chest. And
there's a nice little biographical chime there, because Carol would have been brought up to be very familiar with the
India
Bible. Her
Bibles,
parents were Church of Scotland missionaries,
Yeah.
but her father, of course, was a medic. He was a surgeon and also a university teacher. But this would be material. You can imagine that kind of tactile haptic experience of books in the Bible.
Yeah, and the other book another book that's kept in her studio is her father's old Gray's Anatomy that he gave her when she went to art school, thinking you'll be studying anatomy at art school, which perhaps she did a little bit, even in the late 70s, early 80s. But yeah, and then she would pick these papers very specifically. It was almost like picking the right paper for this composition that was beginning to take place in her head and in her, and as she drew together particular source material, particular image she remembers from that particular book that she had used before or had always wanted to use, and then this particular photograph that she took taking off Charles de Gaulle or something, and then this is the right piece of paper, and then even it's completely pragmatic. These coloured pencils that she used for the tracings, it was just to tell her, well, the yellow is already traced. Now I'm using the purple, but the picking of these very humble Cumberland coloured pencils, was actually sort of secretly highly aesthetic thing as well, and all of that goes into the drawings.
And the paper and the pencil and the eraser kind of begs the question of the paint, and the way that we're talking about the specificity of the materials. And Andrew, Carol was very interested in just the very fact of paint, that it was material stuff. It was made from the earth itself, from minerals, possibly from natural resources or from interesting chemicals. And I think she was very interested in how that kind of played out right through pictorial space. So she was interested about the kind of sensation of the earth and of minerals and gemstones as well. I remember when I wrote about her work in 2017, I talked a lot about that kind of actions on the earth that you can see in the painting. I wrote that the land is gouged and excavated, it's scoured and scored, it's drilled, exposed, it's mined, it's flooded or drained, it's scrubbed, peeled or concealed. And I think one of the things that you've talked about in the past is the notion of the kind of painting as a kind of skin, and Carol's interest in the skin of the earth in the work.
Well, I think it's in a way you could almost say that the picture knows what everything is in it. And she definitely talked about things, imagining something being wet, for example. And the literal weight of the paint, it would literally, and the way that the paint is used and different colours are used, it's a very, very tactile way of thinking about this, but literally thinking yourself in the space. She talks about that painting Bay, imagining being on the streets in that painting. Yeah. But certainly it's not just about the colour and the form, it's actually literally, the atmosphere almost, whether something's wet, whether something's dry, whether it's hot, whether it's got, she was thinking about that. And I think that's kind of very unusual, I think, to be that level of specificity. But that's fascinating. But I think the way that if you look at the way that the paint's applied, even in a single paint, you get some painting like it's a painting called Pond Area, which has very rarely been exhibited at all, with great long sort of diagonals, quite broad brushstrokes. And there'll be other areas in painting very finely painted, and then other very simple, gestural brushstrokes. But the whole thing sort of does all cohere in a very interesting way. But it's partly to do with that very particular way. And she would, if something didn't quite work, the whole composition would come off. I think it wasn't unusual for sort of whole areas of a painting to disappear if it didn't quite balance right.
Oh yeah.
Merlin's more better for explaining as the
well,
technique,
another thing that there's emerged in the studio is lots of abandoned paintings and unfinished paintings, which show how very physical the making can be and how very they look like abstract expressionist painting largely, you know. They're not at all, although there is this immense finesse and minutiae. There's also a very, very physical, and it is to do with these qualities of pigments and qualities of binder and all, the material thing. It is to do with letting the materials be what they are, as well as making them be what they are depicting. And yeah, the idea that there is maybe some physical correlation. You know, she's using minerals, she's using earths, she's using plants. You know,
and there's a sense, I think, isn't there, that kind of excavated often language, that there's also kind of intellectual quarrying that goes on in the work.
Yeah. Yes, that's right, and symbolism, if you want to use that word. Yes,
There's some visual metaphors, aren't there?
Yes, visual metaphor. I mean, Tom Lubbock has written well on that.
Yeah.
There has been some good writing on her work over the years, and
you mentioned Grey's Anatomy, and Carol loved the painter George Stubbs, the 18th century horse painter, who I think we all can see as more than a simple horse painter, and I think possibly embraced a kind of complex political version of for example, Englishness in Stubbs's context.
Yeah.
I was really interested that recently the artist Sarah Barker, who was taught by Carol, talked about Carol in relation to Stubbs and described this particular aspect of we've talked maybe about the skin of the land, we've talked about the skin of the painting. And Sarah said that she felt, when she looked at many of the works that are apparently landscapes, that she could feel the flexed muscles beneath the skin. When you wrote about Carol in 2007, Merlin, you did, for her major survey show at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, you did touch upon this relationship with the body. I wonder if you could tell us about how that figures in a body of work that apparently has no human presence in it.
But they're extremely anthropomorphic in their way, and I think they're a lot about bodies and and she was, you know, very funny, and she was very funny about them and how rude, you know, she's saying incredibly rude, you know, this bit of the painting or that bit of, you know, they're preposterously sort of anatomical in some ways.
There's mischief there, isn't there? Sometimes some of the works I've referred to, you might, for example, see a human head in a tree or an eye in a roundabout, but let's be frank, there's a lot of female anatomy there. There's gashes, you know, and then there's kind of rude promontories and inlets. I mean, she knew what she was doing.
Oh very, very much, and and the whole, you know, an Indian painting, an Indian erotic painting, and you know, and Japanese erotic prints and all of these were quite. These are also books that are in the studio, and you know, science. She was a big science fiction kind of buff, and the subgenre of science fiction erotica was, you know, was very interesting to her as well, and
I think that plays really powerfully into the sense of the way that the paintings kind of animate things that are apparently inert. There's a kind of sense, sense of kind of momentum and flow, and a kind of bodily dance in the work. I wanted to move from that kind of very powerful sense to something that maybe at first seems a bit more prosaic, but I think is really interesting in the context of this exhibition being in Glasgow. And I think that's one of the things that became apparent looking at the drawings, thinking through the source materials, and that's some sense about how Carol really engaged just with the lived urban world around her. We've talked about the use of sources, maps, the idea. I still love this idea that you would write to somebody to get your photograph of Gatwick Airport. And who else was doing this? You know, are these like international espionage or plane spotters?
There's a big archive in Cambridge called something like the Cambridge Aerial Photography. You know, she was in correspondence with the director to that, and was always sort of getting images from them.
So there's that kind of sense of that source material, but there's also something just much more kind of ordinary and observed. And I think one of the things that we enjoyed about the kind of Glasgow setting, about being in Kelvingrove, not far from where Carol had lived in Kelvinbridge initially, was that world around her. So in the images, we've got a drawing of that great downward escalator at Kelvinbridge Underground, although she takes great liberties with what she sees. So, you know, it ends up not in the subway station as we know it, but in a kind of sequence of porta cabins. I totally love, there's some images that drawings that draw upon the high flats at Cowcaddens, and she slyly turns what actually was a pedestrian underpass, and I think a road, into a kind of river, and that there's something so kind of indicative of how she worked. I think we spotted an Asda superstore, a familiar car park barrier. And one of the things that I like to kind of think about Carol is just that how she got that really amazing thrill out of just cycling through a piece of kind of neglected Clydeside scrub, you know, maybe between a flat and a studio. What have you learned, Andrew, about how she worked with the real landscape of the city of Glasgow? And how much more work do you think, you know, what's the balance there? How much do you want to uncover?
Yes, well, that's a very good point. I mean, it's been fascinating, actually. I hadn't realised the extent to which there was a grounding with particular locations. I mean, there is a run of drawings in the show which are connected very closely to this area of the car park and the park by Kelvinbridge subway, which, as you say, she lived in a flat that overlooked that. And there will be an opportunity later this year at the Hunterian to see the paintings that were done in relation to that. And this, I'm definitely going to do some more work on this, but it's a very good point. What to the level you said, I don't, you know, to leave a certain amount of ambiguity. I mean, she clearly changed things around, but it's very interesting that the reason we know that these are a group of paintings is she actually refers to it in an interview, that she had done this group based on one location, which she said was unusual for her. But it's very interesting, it is Glasgow, and it's very related to a particular location in Glasgow that she knew extremely well. But it's also an area that she was passing through, or not just looking down on, but passing through and in different ways. So I think that's very interesting. It's obviously this idea of passing through, into, around, across a landscape, experiencing the different changes of the ground, you know, as you would experience as you're walking, you're cycling. I mean, there's some mention I've made before, but there's a letter from her which she said she wrote on a bus. She said, I'm right in the middle, excuse my handwriting, but I'm on a bus between Glasgow and Edinburgh in the middle of one of my paintings. And this idea, so it's kind of these things and what you see as you're passing through at different speeds and your connection in different ways to the landscape. But I think, so there's a lot, I think there's some very interesting things. But yes, not to be too specifically saying, this is definitely here, this was this, I think that would be missing the point, really. It would be going too far. She wouldn't have, you know, wanted everything identified. We're not going to go and identify. What is interesting, though, in some of the drawings, and particularly some of the studies, is there are little notations from which book this has come from. Or even it might be a colour note, but it may be also a particular building that's from a particular photograph. So she did make notes on these. I think presumably went to go back to see, well, let's look at that again when the drawing develops. But yes, there's an interesting area there to see how much we can actually learn from the notes, looking at the books that are in the studio, and then perhaps actually I'm spending some time in that park maybe and just seeing what, you know, if it's changed a bit, because these paintings started in about 95, I think. They went on for about 6 years. There's 5, I think, altogether.
There's an interesting thing when you're talking about that kind of moving through the landscape, that a kind of essential question or conundrum at the heart of Carol's work seems to be, how do you make your home in the world. How do you reach that point of contact with the earth? And I just wanted to revisit a couple of the images that we've already talked about before, which is this recurring image of the tent and also of the caravan. There's a kind of interesting sense of, there's something slightly comical. These are kind of British. There's
the caravan
slightly
is
satirical.
a very funny painting.
But there's also something about that sense of how you make a temporary shelter in the world and how we attempt to get close to the earth.
Yes, and I think, she had a great affection for the tent and the caravan and perhaps felt that they are much more benign. There's a benignity about their reticence in making a footprint, that in a sense it's not necessarily that rootedness is all or that foundation is all. It may be that foundations are part of the problem, and maybe a lighter sort of occupation of the terrain is a more human one or something. She had come down to rest finally in a sense in that flat in Park Road, and that's where she and Richard Walker had their son Hamish and so on, and it was the route, that car park was her route, or Richard's route, with the pram to school and back and so on, to nursery, where they would take him to nursery, paint like mad for a few hours and then go and get him again. But yes, and this may be part of her affection for, as well as skepticism about, airports and industrial belts and all of these somewhat unrooted structures, that this is the nature of human occupancy of the planet in a way that it's rather fragile, and although it is very destructive and it is very self-destructive and so on in lots of ways. But
it's interesting to reflect on that in this particular historical moment, as we are at a particular point in the pandemic, but also in a particular point where we understand far more about our kind of relationship with the planet. Carol's work wasn't didactic about these points, but seemed to really understand and anticipate them, was kind of born out of her experience of landscape and migration, her experience of radicalism at places like Greenham Common. We can see how these works speak to a kind of global picture really
that is
eloquently.
part of her. Yes, and she was a lifelong Greenpeace supporter and Amnesty supporter and so on. She wouldn't make a big deal. She was slightly the discussion of her activism was heating up towards the end of her life, as it turned out, and she was always a little bit sheepish about that and said, I was not some big activist like some of her friends were, down in Nicaragua, sort of at the front. She just said we were all just, this is what you did then. You went on protests, you did. So she didn't used to bang the drum for herself in that way at all. But absolutely, it's there, and it's there. It gets into the paintings. That politics definitely, and and they do look different. They do look different now. They look different all the time as time goes by, and prescient in lots of ways.
This seems a good moment as we come towards a conclusion to ask about how the work perhaps sits in its time, and also in the story of contemporary painting. And I wondered if I could hear from you, Andrew, about your feelings about the importance and distinctive nature of this work and where it sits in relation to its context.
Well, I think it's interesting to see it in the context of, making paintings in Glasgow in the early 1990s, because it sort of comes on the back of that sort of very heavily figurative generation that many of whom she was at art school with. But by that time, of course, that was not. The 90s were perhaps more coolly conceptual. Let's say it certainly also doesn't fit in quite the same way with some of the the art was coming out of the environmental art course at Glasgow around that time. I mean, it had similar interest, but it was painting. But I think there's something that's quite particular. It didn't feel to be of its time then, and I think it has a timeless. It was, if anything, it's more timely now than it perhaps was at the then. I think there's what strikes me about Carol's paintings. There's a uniqueness about them. She never repeated herself, I don't think. There's no series. It's not like there are not series of variations. There isn't a Carol Rhodes brand, if you like. Their elements don't necessarily resolve in a determinate sense of all about. I think they have something that really does repay a quiet, longer look at them, really. And I think that's what, they don't, unlike a lot of the sort of figurative painting of, even when she started and even now, it seems to be sort of so much sort of, Merlin, I don't know, the way that so much painting now is looking back to the 80s again, whether it knows it or not. It's this kind of, but that was never the case with Carol's work. And there are allusions to art history. We mentioned some of that, but nothing. It's very difficult to pin down a particular source. That's from a stuff. That's from an Indian miniature. It's as if they're all there. There's this elusiveness, if you like. There's and so they allude to things, but they don't necessarily specifically talk about them. And I think that's, for me, I've just got a little small line from Merlin mentioned Tom Lubbock earlier, who was one of the, I think, most astute writers on Carol's work. Sadly, no longer with us either. And he wrote in a review of the Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh, the survey show in 2007-8, that the paintings, they wait for your close attention. When they get it, they unfold into an experience that's large in resonance and complexity. And I think that place is, that's for me what makes them significant and makes them stand out from a lot of small oil paintings that, are made and still being made and all, I think that's her uniqueness. And there is this an intensity of vision which I think comes across. But they're not something that immediately, you have to look at them. I think they're not a quick fix. They're not... nor are they sort of full of obvious kind of, this is a visual puzzle, I've got to work out what this is. And nor do they have an agenda which you've got, you write 3 sides of A4 and what this, each bit of this painting.
What are you seeing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's that for me what makes them, gives them a sort of timeless, it's interesting that, having the different way people have seen them and the reactions that have been over the years since I was showing them. And, there was always a small group of people who loved them from the start. But it's interesting that critically the interest in them has built slowly over the years. They were almost too kind of small and simple looking in a way to immediately attach attention. But now I think it's becoming more and more people actually realizing what how significant
there was a phase, I suppose, I don't know exactly when, but I mean for a period they were getting put into shows with a lot of maybe other painting whose agenda was a kind of postmodern skeptical interrogation of the nature of representation, the artificiality or the fictionality of the simulacrum, and the things that there were moments when these buzzwords dominate, and her work, I suppose a lot of figurative painting was somewhat in the shadow of Gerhard Richter, and there were some group shows in the 2000s, I suppose, that. And then there were others that were more apropos. I mean, she was in this nice show in 1999 with, Bob Law, Prunella Clough. I think maybe Thomas Scheibitz was in there. That it's interesting to look back at the shows that they were in and see where it fits or doesn't fit.
Despite a kind of chill, perhaps, in there. She was never a cool painter. It wasn't a painting about cool, a practice about cool. And certainly when we think of other people who were using this kind of aerial view, you think of the kind of grand postmodern photography
Yes,
that was
yes.
around at the time.
Yeah. That she was very conscious of.
Yeah, she
but-
wasn't interested in that same kind of all-seeing eye, though. And
No.
I just wondered, Merlin, if you could bring us back to this idea of see the world, because I think there's something, we've talked a lot about kind of discipline, distance, disengagement, but there also is, you know, an absolute emotional and physical engagement with the world that I think this notion of seeing
Yes.
includes.
Yes, what is it to see the world, really? And to see requires a degree of detachment or distance. Yes, but it's not ultimately the goal or the yes, intimacy is not necessarily absolute contact. You
Yeah.
know, intimacy might be to do with the perfect distance or
Yeah.
something like that,
And,
perhaps.
and in that phrase, I think, see the world, we have the seeing bit,
Yes.
but we have the world.
Yes.
And I think, to me, that's what's so extraordinary, that these paintings can contain such complex information about the world, such feelings about the
Yes.
world, in what's apparently, I think there's wonderful things Carol used to say about, you know, this is just a smear on a flat surface.
Yes, and yet it
Yeah.
and yet it has this
and yet
information.
it has this absolute.
And has her identity in it. I mean, it's the extent to which the work, I think has her personality is amazing, and it's not a big mysterious sort of mystical thing. It's just that when somebody has a way of making certain marks, a way of choosing certain colours, it's a finger, you know, it's an absolute fingerprint of
It's
that
there.
person, and it may not even be to do with whether they're good works of art or not. You know, that may be just as true of not great works of art, but.
I think happily where we are is that
in this case,
they really are, which is why we're here together in the room
yeah,
today.
it's very moving seeing the show.
yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah. So I would like to thank you, Merlin, and I would like to thank Andrew. So thank you, Andrew Mummery and Merlin James, for this event, and for all the work done on the exhibition. I think I'd also like to say a few thanks on behalf of Andrew Mummery, to say thanks to the Carol Rhodes Estate, to Alison Jake's Gallery, to the many private lenders to the exhibition, the staff at Glasgow Museums and here at Glasgow International, to the Bridget Riley Foundation for their support. I think above all to Carol Rhodes' family and friends. Thank you.
thanks.